Hello, this is a continuance of the discussion that was started, was it last week sometime, on epistemology within polytheism. And I've had a couple of questions in from people who've been listening to the previous one, and I'll try and address those questions as we go along and give some semblance of an answer, but also to pick up on some other issues that I think are worth exploring. They interest me, and hopefully they might interest at least some other people as well. In terms of kind of where to pick up from last time and move in a slightly different direction this time, I thought it'd be worth looking at the various phases of culture as they're understood by historians such as Elizabeth Eisenstein. She is one of a number of people who have written around the transitions between different forms of cultural recording. So the way this is usually presented is that we begin with oral culture, pre-literate cultures in which either nobody can read and write at all, or at least very, very, very few people can, and therefore almost everything is done at an oral level. If you want to hear what the storyteller is talking about today, you have to go and sit in front of the storyteller and listen to him or her, because there's no other way of doing it. You can't read a book, and the storyteller can't write a book. There's no such thing as books, perhaps, in that period of history or in that culture. And so everything is word of mouth transmission. And likewise, not just storytellers, but anything. If you want to learn medicine, if you want to learn agriculture, if you want to learn carpentry, you have to go and be with the person who teaches you, and they tell you they don't just give you a bunch of books and say go away and read these books. They have to explain everything to you, show you, demonstrate to you. It's all verbal, it's all oral. And obviously historically every single culture started as an oral culture, in as much as writing is a comparatively late invention, and so for the bulk of human history we have been an oral species. We move from the oral, historically, into manuscript culture, which is when people develop writing, and everything is done by hand. So although it says manuscript culture, obviously the idea of somebody with a quill pen sitting writing on a piece of parchment, that would include things like cuneiform writing stamped into clay, and Egyptian sculptors carving hieroglyphs into stone and so on. So in other words, it's all forms of writing done by hand in some shape, guise, form or another. And within manuscript cultures, because of the nature of how education tends to work, I don't suppose it absolutely has to work this way, maybe it could be done differently, but the way it tends to work is that very few people can read, very few people can write, and so although we're talking about oral culture and manuscript culture as if they're two different things, they coexist. So even once manuscript culture is invented, and there are people who can read and write and so on, nonetheless the vast majority of people can't, and so the vast majority of people continue to have an oral culture, whilst a minority of people, the highly educated, have manuscript culture. And there are transitions and changes in notions of truth and ideas of epistemology, how we understand things, how we know things, how we engage with reality. So that goes not only into epistemology, the notion of knowledge and how we validate knowledge and verify knowledge, but also into notions of ontology, how we understand reality, our own reality and other people's realities and so on. In an oral culture, you understand the reality of the people you can meet and sit and listen to. Obviously, a lot of people you might meet, you just have no time to say more than, lovely weather for the time of year, and that's about it, and you move on. And so there's no real deep conversation. Think of all of the people you meet on a day-to-day basis, well, in normal times, if not necessarily in weird lockdown times. How many of them do you have deep conversations with? Hardly any. And there's no real reason to suppose that in ancient Rome, ancient Athens, ancient Karnak, people had any higher frequency of deep, profound conversations then than they do now, because people have busy lives. They've got jobs to do and fields to till the crops in and farm animals to look after and all the rest of it. Therefore, sitting still and having deep, profound conversations to gain an insight into somebody else's reality it's a luxury in a sense. You've got to have enough food available to you that you can afford to sit down and just talk for an hour or two or three and not have to be running around collecting food, hunting food, growing food, building shelters and doing all of the other basic survival things. So if you live in a survival level society, you don't have a lot of time for sitting around talking endlessly. Your time is occupied by just surviving. So the opportunity for long conversation is something of a luxury that comes with a better standard of living when you can take time out to do things that are not directly related to food and immediate survival. But I say, ontology, understanding how other people see the world, what kind of ideas they have about the world, what thoughts and feelings and impressions and experiences, where they've been, what they've done, who they've seen, who they've met, all that kind of thing, would have had to be done orally, face-to-face, direct discussion. And so you get, which is a key point here, in face-to-face discussion, you not only get the actual words somebody is saying, but you get tone of voice, facial expressions, hand gestures, all sorts of things. You form impressions. Is this person honest? Are they lying? Are they joking? Are they angry? Are they sarcastic? Are they, what are they? So you get all of that subtle nuance of understanding, which a scroll, a page of writing, or a load of hieroglyphs chipped into the stone doesn't give you. You get no sense of nuance from that. So manuscript culture, written culture, conveys knowledge and information and ideas very differently from a spoken conversation. It doesn't have that nuance to it. And so different kinds of ideas get recorded than necessarily get spoken about. For one thing, you've only got so much paper, particularly in, I think the production of papyrus or goat skin vellum or whatever it may be that you're trying to create to write on as a surface, can be very time consuming and remarkably expensive. And so once you've got your sheet of writing material, or you're going to carve into a wall or whatever it is you're going to do, you've got to be very concise about what you want to say. You can't afford to waffle, because this is expensive stuff. It takes a lot of time and so forth to record. And usually, in a lot of the time, what we're seeing is that people are concerned about what they record, at least in the very early days of manuscript culture, because it is time consuming, it's expensive, and so forth. As education becomes more widespread and a wider number of people can read and write, and new writing materials are developed, new forms of paper or whatever it is that you're going to write on, new methods of writing are developed, like wax tablets and things like that. So there is a kind of a moving down the social scale. Much like, for example, when electronic computers and laptops and things are very first invented, and they're phenomenally expensive, and very few people can afford them, very few people can use them, and then gradually, year on year, they get cheaper and cheaper and cheaper, and more people can acquire them. And so it goes from being a prize of the very wealthy elite to something that much more people, middle class people, working class people, sometimes even desperately poor people can lay hands to and access. And it's the same with writing, that in the very early days it's a very elite thing to do, and then gradually it disseminates down the social hierarchy and more people can do it. And so you end up with things like the Vindolanda letters of Roman soldiers on Hadrian's Wall writing letters home saying, "Can you knit me some more socks, Mum?" and things like that. So the kind of everyday humdrum things that we say to each other today by text message or phone call or letter or whatever. In other words, it's no longer using highly expensive paper and highly expensive inks and highly expensive everything else to only send the most important of messages and sending them in the most concise fashion because you can't afford to waste ink and you can't afford to waste paper. It's there by the time we're getting into letters from soldiers saying, send me some more socks, this one's got a hole in it. By the time you're getting to that level, the kind of the commonplace nature of conversation has taken over because the materials are so much cheaper, the papers, the inks, the everything else is so much cheaper, and people are able to send ordinary everyday messages rather than very focused messages where you've got to think really hard. Do I actually want to put this to paper because I know it's going to cost a lot of money? Do I actually want to record this on this piece of goat vellum or whatever it may be? And so it changes the nature not just of who can write, but also what we write about. What messages are important? What messages are worth writing? What's worth recording? And what do you want other people to know? So you might want your mum to know you need more socks, something like that. Or you might want to send a love letter to your intended, and you want them to know how romantic you feel towards them and all that palaver. Or you want to record some great statement of law or a pronouncement of a king or a queen or whoever it is, something that's considered weighty and that other people need to know about. And so we get all sorts of different concepts and different ideas as to who needs to know what knowledge is important, what understandings of the world are important and worth knowing, and who do we want to know them. And that in itself becomes an element within manuscript culture, in that a spoken conversation, you choose who you speak to, maybe a one-to-one conversation, or you're speaking to an entire crowd of people. A letter, a recorded statement, whether it's in the nature of a religious scripture or a legal pronouncement or just a letter home saying, send me socks, it's intended for a particular audience, to be consumed by that audience. And so there is a sense of what do I want this person to know? Do I want them to know this once and then forget about it? You read the letter saying more socks, you knit some socks, you send them off, end of. Or is it something that's meant to be understood for a long period of time? This is the king's pronouncement on so-and-so thing, and it must be kept on record so that people in 10 years, 20 years, 100 years' time can still read the king's pronouncement on so-and-so thing. The weightiness of the message shifts and turns and changes. There's also this notion of permanence that comes in with a manuscript culture. An oral conversation, once it's had, is had. It can be repeated. You can say, well, my next door neighbour told me so and so thing, and now I'm going to repeat it to you. And it gets repeated and repeated. And obviously, you've got that sort of element of Chinese whispers coming in, where sometimes by the 12th repetition, it's lost all context and it's ended up meaning something entirely other than what it started out meaning. But there is a sort of ephemeral nature to an oral conversation. Unless you get to the point of committing certain, for example, poems, stories, recitations of law, and we've got accounts from many cultural sources, one of which, for example, in Ireland up until the medieval period, every 3 years on the hill of Tara, at the great royal court there, or the Brehon judges, and into Christian period of time, the bishops and various chieftains and dignitaries and other people would gather every 3 years, once every 3 years, and for a week or so they would have recitations of law. So people would stand up and they would recite great chunks of law. And this wasn't just to cure insomnia, this was to validate memory, that we are recording law orally, and even though by this period of time, by the time the bishops were involved, Ireland was a literate culture and could record laws on parchment. Nonetheless, the continuance of tradition from when Ireland was a predominantly oral culture persisted even once it had become a manuscript culture. So demonstrations of memory, a bit like those kind of Victorian human encyclopedias that would go onto the Victorian Music Hall and say, oh, ask me any question and I will tell you the answer to it, and they would have phenomenal memories of all sorts of obscure bits of information. So this was a demonstration of human memory, and also a chance for the audience to reflect on those laws, because having recited them, they would then debate them. Do we want to drop this bit of law? Do we want to change the wording of that bit of law? Do we want to add a brand new law? So it was a way of updating and revising the law, as well as reinforcing law by hearing it, reciting it, treating it as something terribly important rather than as a kind of this tedious and bureaucratic morass, which is often how we think of law these days, and it's all very dull and difficult to understand, and something we kind of leave to the specialists to wade through. This was a sense that law was a sacred thing that had to be recited in almost the same way you might have Bible readings on a Sunday, or going back to pagan times, storytellers recalling and reciting the ancient myths and traditions. That this was an important thing to listen to and know about and understand and discuss and so on. So there's that kind of, again, example of coexisting oral and manuscript cultures. But it is possible to have a sense of, which is why I'm using this example, possible to have a sense of enduring knowledge in an oral culture if you have regular recitations of the same thing and you aspire to memorize it. But the vast majority of conversations that take place orally are forgotten quite quickly. They don't persist in memory for years and years and years, or persist in culture because they're not preserved in the same way. There are questions arising as to who is tasked with memorizing those elements of culture that are considered sufficiently important, sufficiently worthy, like the sacred stories, like the recitations of law, like the genealogies of the rich and powerful. Did anyone bother to memorize the genealogies of the poor? Possibly they did. We don't know anymore, but perhaps they just didn't bother. So again, what is considered important, what's worth memorizing, what's not worth memorizing and reciting and recording. But there is always the risk in an oral culture that if a plague comes along, or a war or a famine, and there's mass death, your storytellers die off, your Brayon judges die off, the knowledge contained in their heads dies off with them. And so there is a kind of even with attempts at recitation and repetition and memory and so on, there is always that risk that oral cultures have a kind of an ephemeral quality to them where they might die and the knowledge might be lost. And part of this also, going back to the epistemological issue, is the extent to which memory is verifiable. So if the Brayon comes into the room and says, right, I'm going to recite to you the law code about the keeping of bees and beehives, and they go blah, 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 and they bang on for an hour reciting the laws, how do you as an audience know they are correct, that they haven't forgotten a bit or added a bit or changed a bit? They are tasked with memorizing it verbatim, and you trust them to do it. And there may be more than one Brayon in the room, so there could be another Brayon in the corner. Goes, hang on a minute, Fred, you've forgotten that. You've forgotten rule number 56B. And so there's maybe a degree of challenging and kind of testing the veracity of memory. But it can only be done to a certain extent. Once you shift into a manuscript culture, what is written upon the page lasts as long as the page lasts. And so you can have that sense of somebody saying, well, I'm now going to recite to you by reading from this page. And so you're not just kind of dependent on the accuracy of their memory, and we all know how woolly our memories can be at times, but you have the page to double check with. Or at least those people capable of reading it have the opportunity to double check that the person reciting it really has recited it correctly. And this does start to become an issue later on in history, during the Christian period, when various different factions and schisms were taking place within the church. there were sometimes charges that particularly rural priests, because most of their congregation couldn't read the Bible, or anything else for that matter, couldn't read, and so they were reliant on the priest to read out passages from the Bible and tell them what it meant, because it was heavy symbolism and probably half of them hadn't got a clue what it meant. There were concerns within the church hierarchy amongst the bishops and the cardinals and the archbishops and everybody else as to whether particularly local rural priests, the kind of ones at the bottom of the pecking order, were always doing their Bible readings terribly well. Were they sufficiently educated that they themselves could read the Bible accurately and understand it and interpret it? Or were they just stood in the pulpit going, oh, well, it means this, and just saying something that was perhaps heretical or just fake? And so there were these concerns developing within the hierarchy of the church that even where you've got manuscript cultures, you've got the page with the words on it. If only one person in the community can read it, how does anybody else in the community verify the accuracy of what is read? And they are trusting to the accuracy of the revealed word as being, this is actually what Jesus said, this is actually what Mark, Luke, John said, did, where they went, what they got up to. These stories are accurate stories and not half-remembered, garbled, badly recorded stories. So there is a faith, a trust, not only in God, in Christ, or you put this in a pagan context, in, say, Zeus or Hera or Apollo or whoever it may be, but there is a trust in the reliability of the written word to describe the events that are supposed to have taken place accurately. And this does raise what I think are some interesting questions as to how people in the ancient world understood the function and role of what we now call mythology, the mythos, the sacred stories. Did they understand them in the context that, let's say, a Muslim might understand the Quran, or a Jewish person might understand the Torah as a revealed word, a set of absolute truths? Or did they understand them as metaphor, as symbolism, as not necessarily actual events, but as deeper layered meanings and guidance for human life and human decision making? So if you take, let's say the stories of Hercules, or Heracles if you want to be Greek, and the 12 labours. If we take the 12 labours, so we're told that Heracles is instructed to go off and fight the Nemean lion. Now, did ancient Greeks, hearing this story, they're sitting around in their tavernas, sipping their ouzo and being terribly stereotypical and throwing plates at each other, did they believe, A, Heracles was definitely a real person who had existed, and did they believe, B, the lion, the Nemean lion, definitely existed, and did they believe that, C, Heracles went off and beat up the Nemean lion and ended up wearing its skin? Did they take these as history? This had happened, this is a historical statement. Or did they regard this as symbolism? The Nemean lion represents animal passions, or the lion is an image of royalty, and so this was an out-of-control king who needed to be subdued, or any one of 100 other possible symbolic interpretations of the story. And so when they were listening to it, were they thinking of this as history? This is an account of an event that happened 10 years ago, 100 years ago, 1,000 years ago? Or were they listening to this and thinking, well, this represents a transition in the development of the human soul and a challenge that we could all face, and it's symbolic and representative? Part of that, well, obviously we don't really know because most of the audiences, 99% of the audiences, never wrote down their thoughts and feelings at the time. But part of this is the sense of, if you go and listen to a storyteller in January who tells you the story of the Nemean lion, and you go and listen to a different storyteller in July who goes and tells you the story of the Nemean lion, and those storytellers give slightly different versions. They're not word for word identical, they are slightly different in some way. Did people back then go, "You've got that wrong. That never happened. That storyteller I heard in January told it different to you. What's the real version?" In other words, was this seen as history? There is a real version, either it happened or it didn't happen, and we want to know the facts. Or did they interpret it symbolically? Therefore, if one storyteller told it this way and the other storyteller told it that way, maybe as long as the symbolic context is essentially the same, the details are peripheral and don't matter. So did people get shirty with their storytellers? Once you've got manuscript culture, you're reading from a page, the assumption is, and it is an assumption, I'll grant you, but the assumption is that every single version of that page, if you've got 500 Bibles, page 10 of every Bible should be identical. Word for word identical. You don't expect to pick up this copy of the Bible and find out that page 10 has different words on it than this copy of the Bible has. You expect them to be identical. And not just obviously for the Bible. You could say the same for if you're reading an Agatha Christie or any book under the sun. You pick it up, you've got three copies of the same book, you expect them to be word for word the same. So it's not down to the vagaries of human memory or the creativity of this storyteller versus that storyteller. This one's embellished it a bit more vividly than that one has embellished it, who tells it in a more straightforward fashion. The story is fixed upon the page. And so part of Eisenstein's argument is that once you get the sense of manuscript culture developing with information being fixed upon a page, people start to develop in a culture the idea that truth is fixed, rather than the notion that it can be, with different storytellers, different priests, priestesses, different whoever it happens to be reciting a story, a poem, or whatever, that flexibility can come into oral culture and be understood and accepted and not a cause of major dispute, in a way that doesn't happen with manuscript culture. Because in a manuscript, the page should be the same. Every copy of that page should be the same. You don't expect the individual scribe to start thinking, "I'm on board with this, I'm going to write something completely different because I feel like it." That would be a betrayal of the scribe's duty. The duty of the scribe is to repeat word for word from the original page to the copy they're making. The scribe should not be adding, dropping, misspelling, altering what they're writing down. It should be the same. So the scribe is also almost like the human version of a photocopier. They should be just reproducing version for version for version. Once you've got this notion that certain forms of truth are fixed, does that, and this is an argument not only from Eisenstein but from various other people as well, does that start to permeate into wider culture? So it maybe starts with the written page, but then it spreads out that people get this idea that truth with a capital T is a fixed notion, not something subject to interpretation and the vagaries of memory and recall and artistic flourishes of storytellers and poets and what have you. It is something more objective rather than something subjective. If you start to get that notion, is, and I'm not saying it is, I'm just asking a question, is that what leads to violent clashes, where person A says, "You have misinterpreted the truth, you have falsified the truth, you've added a sentence or dropped a sentence." And we know within quite a few of those religions that are book-based, scripturally based, they have in their history have had periods of dispute where maybe differing versions of the same sacred text appear, not massively different, but one version has certain words in it and another version has different words in it, and it's not just a case of saying, of people going, that's odd, but rather people get very impassioned, and there are accusations made of one version being the correct version and the other one being a false version, not just misprints, typing error, well, they had typing back then, being typographical errors, mistaken versions, but being misleading, deliberately misleading, maybe even blasphemous. And the notion that this version of something is not merely a mistaken version or a badly written version or a version that's missing a page or something, but it is in some sense wicked. And it leads to disputes as to the interpretation of doctrine, because the version this group is, the version of the book this group is using is different in some respect to the version of the group, the version of the book that other group over there is using. And so you get rifts between people who think version A of the book is correct and people who think version B of the book is correct. It leads to real hostility sometimes. There are pagan manuscripts, things like the Havamar, which is the words of the High One, a very long poem attributed to Odin. You've got the Eddas within the Scandinavian Norse cycles. You have the Theogony, Homer and Hesiod and all the various Greek writers and Roman writers and so on, and the Egyptian writers. So there's all sorts of more literate pagan cultures which had their own stories written down. Sometimes, as with the Greek versions, those stories were written down by people who were themselves pagan and believers in those gods and stories. And other times you've got accounts of stories written down by Christian monks recollecting stories from their heritage and their past. So here is an Irish monk writing a story which they heard from their grandmother, who heard it from her grandmother, and even though it involves pagan gods and heroes, it now gets written down. Not by someone who believes in it as a pagan themselves, but by someone who is a part of an ongoing culture and heritage and tradition. How do we, as 21st century pagans, polytheists, whatever you want to term you want to use, how do we understand those written texts? Perhaps there is a significant difference between how, let's say, the theogony is understood, something written by polytheists for polytheists in a polytheist period of history, and something like the Irish or the Welsh myths, which were written down long after most of the pagans were dead and buried by Christian monks by and large, and so kind of written to a somewhat more second-hand stance rather than from the point of view of a person who devoutly believes in those gods and spirits and entities and so forth. So if we go for things written by polytheists for polytheists, how do we understand, let's say, the Havamar or the Theogony? Do we see this as a revealed scripture in the same way that the Bible or the Quran or the Torah is understood as a revealed scripture in those respective religions? So is the Havamar, the words of the High One, actually the words of the High One? Do we feel that Odin turned up to earth, picked up a bit of vellum and some quill pens and sat and wrote the Havamar down and then handed a copy to whoever it was? Or do we regard this as the work of a human being, some human, mortal, fallible scribe who perhaps from a vision or a dream or some mystical experience woke up one morning and went, wow, this poem has leapt into my head, I'm going to write it down because I had a dream of Odin and Odin said all this stuff to me in a dream, and now I'm going to write it down and I'll tell it to somebody else, or tell it to somebody else, or tell it to somebody else, and round it goes. Within those large-scale religions that are centered upon books, there is the notion that by and large those books are regarded as divinely revealed, either the whole of the book or at least big chunks of the book are regarded as divinely revealed, depends on the religion. And therefore the words of God, or Allah, or whatever term you want to use, the words of the divine shouldn't be altered by human beings. What is said by the divine is true with a really big capital T and needs to be sustained as truth, unchanged truth by human beings. It's literalism, or at least that's the term used within Christianity. The Bible is literally true, the word of God, unquestioningly the word of God, and therefore God doesn't make mistakes, doesn't forget bits, doesn't leave stuff out. Human beings writing it down might, but God himself doesn't. Whereas more liberal Christians, and you get, again, within most book-based religions, you get splits between those who take things very literally and those who take things more liberally. The liberal approach tends to say, well, it might have started out divinely revealed, but there's been an awful lot of humans involved in the intervening period who have copied and recopied and recopied, and mistakes get made, and political councils meet within churches and mosques and synagogues and so forth, and sometimes they might kind of hide unpopular texts under the bed and perhaps beef up other parts, and the human interference in the life of a sacred text has to be factored in. So what you're reading might include bits which are the absolute word of God, but might also include bits which are very much the words of highly fallible human beings who bring all of their loves and hates and hopes and ambitions and biases and prejudices and what have you with them. And that has to, I mean, it doesn't mean that there's no worth in what you're reading, but it does mean that what you're reading is a work of a human hand and has to be understood in that light. So given those differences of views within the big global religions, for the polytheist religions, which by and large are quite small scale, how do we understand our texts? As the absolute word of deities, or as the words of humans passed through the filters of humans? So, for example, within the Havamar, there are passages which are not terribly flattering about women and reveal the views of a very male-dominated society from many, many centuries ago, and probably suggest that maybe whoever was holding the quill and writing it down might have been a bloke, writing from a very blokey point of view. Had it been a woman holding the quill, maybe certain phrases might have, certain verses and phrases and sentences might have come out very differently. So do we get all 21st century and go, oh, this is sexist, and have to go lie down in a dark room with a flannel on our face and decide what we want to do about this? Or do we say, no, this is the absolute word of Odin, and like it or lump it, that's what it is, and you've got to live with that? How do we interpret the revealed word? Or indeed, is it the revealed word? That is a question there. And that is part and parcel also, I think, of the whole issue under discussion of the epistemology within polytheism, that a lot of it is oral culture. It's been passed down and passed down and passed down. Stories, myths, traditions, ideas, beliefs, practices, rituals, poetry. Passed down in such a way that no one actually knows who started it. Who wrote that poem? Who discovered that herbal cure? Who came up with that ritual practice? Who very first had this story and told it to an audience? And where did they get that story from? Was it a vision? Was it a dream? Was it just something they made up on the spur of the moment? Where did it come from? That's the bulk of polytheist religious tradition, is transmission through oral routes, but there is some of it which is through written record. Those written records may be collated into central texts like the Havamar, or they may be scattered in 1,000 different places, like all of the various Egyptian scriptures which are found on the sides of coffins, on walls in temples, or walls in tombs, on papyruses, on all sorts of places. There's no one great big bumper book of Egyptian religious scripture. There's a million different pieces in a million different places, written at different points in history by different people at different bits of Egypt, and we nowadays gradually gather them together and deposit them as received Egyptian wisdom. So even where there are written sources, sometimes they're not centralized, sometimes they're scattered all over the place. So how do we today understand them? Do we just take them as ancestral wisdoms which are interesting, insightful, but have to be placed in a historical context? So if they say things we don't like, we can think to ourselves, well, that was then, that's how people thought then, we don't have to think like that now. Or do we go down that more literalist, trying to avoid the word fundamentalist, point of view of saying, nope, this is the absolute word of the divine, and it's true for all time, and it shouldn't be questioned or challenged. It can be understood, and particularly when it's been written in a language from a previous period of history, we need to really delve into that language to understand how that language how those words were thought of at that time, and you get problems in translating from one language to another language, where you don't always get the real flavour of a word, and translation doesn't always work terribly well, which is an issue in and of itself within polytheism, is the extent to which people now need to understand the language in which whatever myths or texts or poetry or sacred songs, whatever it is they're going for, in which those sources were originally recorded. So if you are mad keen on Greek gods, do you need to be able to read the original ancient Greek to understand those stories in their full context and glory, or can you just rely on modern day 21st century translations into English or French or Chinese or whatever language it is that you happen to speak? How significant is the mother tongue in which those stories were first recorded? How well can you ever fully get into the mindset of that mother tongue when maybe it's thousands of years after the original stories were first put down, and you're trying to get into how people thought then? It's not an easy thing to do. Can it be done? Should we aspire to do it? If we take this notion of ongoing contact, that let's say you've got a story about the Greek story of Molus, the god of the mountains. So maybe 3,000 years ago, a group of ancient Greeks sat on the mountain and meditated and communed, and the spirit of Molus spoke to them, and then they went and told other people, and so the revolutions of Molus spread. Well, what's to stop someone in the 21st century going to sit on a mountain and meditate and eventually be communicated with by the spirit of the mountain? Nothing whatsoever to stop them doing that. So can you have ongoing contact and revelation that's as important what you get told today as what somebody 3,000 years ago was told then? And therein becomes this kind of ongoing debate, particularly when different people maybe get told very different things, or at least say they have been told very different things. Because obviously you do always have this issue that merely because somebody goes on the internet and says, oh, I had a dream and I was told this, does that make it gospel truth? That because they say this is what they were told, they are definitely telling the truth, they're not exaggerating, ladling it on, they're on the make, doing whatever they're doing? How do we contextualize people's received wisdoms and received visions? To go back to the previous podcast when we were talking about the Jain idea of Anakantavada, of the blind men and the elephant. 20 people all have visions at different points in time in different parts of the world. Visions of Gaia, the Mother Earth, the goddess of the earth. And each one of those visions is different and maybe even sometimes contradictory. So do we say that one of these visions is right and the other 19 are completely false? Or do we say, like rather than 5 blind men, these are 20 blind people, and each having their own vision, each feeling up their bit of Gaia, so to speak, and reporting what they have found, and they're each having an element of truth. Yes, they have seen something that is true, but they've only seen that much of a picture, and actually the bigger picture is way weirder than the little bit of it that they have got hold of. What we need to do is look at these different seemingly conflicting bits of truth, not as grand revelations, but as jigsaw pieces. And if we put them all together, when we've got all of the jigsaw pieces together, then we'll get an idea of what the picture is. But up until then, there'll be a blue bit, a yellow bit, a green bit, and a red bit, and they're all true. They're just tiny little bits of a much bigger picture. And if all you rely on is one tiny little bit, you'll walk away with a very odd impression of what's going on in the world. How do we understand that? And that, I'd suggest, is an approach maybe quite, I won't say peculiar to polytheism, because you find it within the Vedic religions who can be polytheist, but they're also non-polytheistic Vedic religions. But that kind of pluralism, that multiplicity of truths, is something that sits better with polytheism than it does with the majority of modern day monotheism, which isn't so keen on pluralism by and large. In terms of how we understand these different levels of truth. I'm really rambling, aren't I? Never mind. Going back to Eisenstein, we've done the oral culture, we've mentioned manuscript culture. What we then move into is the invention of the printing press. And this is something that Eisenstein is especially passionate about and has written very extensively about. The printing press shifted us from manuscript culture to print culture. And we're still obviously in print culture, because, I mean, you see behind me, all these books are print culture. What does print culture do? Well, in the first instance, it brings with it a greater sense of accuracy. In that, having said earlier about manuscript culture, you kind of expect if you've got 20 versions of the same manuscript, you expect them to be the same. You expect it, but you've also got to face the realism that when things are being copied out by hand by a bunch of scribes all over the place, they get a book and they sit there and they write it down page for page for page. People make mistakes. They spell a word wrong, especially if it's a period of history in which there is no standardized spelling of words anyway. People spell words how they think they should be spelled rather than by a dictionary standard. And sometimes they doodle little things in the margins. And there may be occasions when someone is encouraged by money or a sword poked up their nether regions, or by their own political ideologies, to alter a text to appease some chieftain, a king, a queen, an emperor, or a bishop, or an imam, or whoever it may be. There is somebody who wants a text altered for their own reasons, and they encourage the scribe to do so. And so sometimes you get kind of deliberate changes to texts, bits dropped out, bits added in, this sort of thing. So we know it happens. We want all handwritten manuscripts to be to the same standard, but we know not all of them will be. Once you get into the printing press, and particularly as obviously the very first printing press was a bit clunky, as technology improves, they get more and more efficient, more and more polished in their designs, and so as printing culture goes on, we get the sense that if a factory churns out 20,000 copies of Murder on the Orient Express, all 20,000 copies will be identical because it's done by machine. And so that kind of human fallibility of scribes who might spell a word wrong, we don't expect the printing press machine to get tired and spell a word wrong. It's not going to happen. So it shifts from human fallibility of mistakes being made into machine standard consistency. It doesn't wholly prevent that political element where someone might be pressured. I mean, obviously the printing machine itself doesn't succumb to pressure. It's the human person putting in the print blocks on the machine, who succumbs to pressure to alter a text if somebody bungs them money or threatens them or whatever, uses means to get them to amend a text in some way. That'll happen still, but it's probably much rarer in print culture than it is in manuscript culture. One of the other big key factors is not so much this kind of machine standardization, but rather availability. A handwritten manuscript, imagine you had to sit and you pick a random book off your shelf and you had to sit and write it out word for word by hand on paper. How long that would take, how tiring and mentally exhausting it would be to do that. And then you're going to sell it. You'd want a hell of a lot of money for that, because the amount of time that would go into writing out an entire book by hand, if you were charging by the hour, that book would cost a fortune. That handwritten manuscript cost a fortune. Whereas a printing press can churn out books, particularly as the technology gets better and better and better, it can churn out books and newspapers and pamphlets and all sorts of things at a phenomenal rate. And as with any kind of mass production, the speedier it becomes, the cheaper it becomes, and the materials involved in the creation of paper and all the rest of it, that's all part and parcel of the process. It's not just the machine that does the printing, but the materials which are being printed upon. All of that changes and alters with new inventions and new discoveries. And so what you end up with are lots of cheap copies of a book rather than phenomenally expensive hand-copied manuscripts, which hardly anyone can afford and hardly anyone can read. When books become more readily available and cheaper and affordable to more and more people, part of the incentive, of course, is that if you can afford it, you are, well, doesn't guarantee that you'll definitely want to be able to read the thing, of course, but you're more likely to want to be able to read something once you can afford to get hold of it, particularly if that something is terribly important to you, such as a sacred religious text. You will want to know what's in it. You'll want to be able to read it. You'll want to be able to get your own copy of it, to feel that you have the word of God in your house. And more than that, it's not just as an ornament to sit on the shelf and look pretty, but has something that you can read. And that has a massive impact on culture. So suddenly it's not just the monks or the priestesses or whoever it is in a given period of history, that given culture, the elite few who can read and write and know the sacred. They can read the hieroglyphs or the cuneiform or the ancient runes or whatever it is. It's no longer just something that is kept to a minority in society. Suddenly a growing number, by no means everyone, but a growing number of people not only can afford copies of the special texts, but want to be able to read them, and so there becomes a demand for education. We want to know what it says. And what that does is remove the text from being the purview of an elite, a wealthy, highly educated elite. Suddenly it shunts down into a kind of a middle class, for lack of a better word, of people who can afford the text because it's much cheaper and can afford to get educated enough to be able to read it. They want to know what it says for themselves, not just sitting in a pew having the priest or the bishop or the rabbi or the imam or whoever telling them what it means. They want to know for themselves what it means. Now, there are some religions like Sikhism where there is a huge drive to make sure everyone, or as close to everyone as you can get, can read the text anyway. So in some religions it never was a kind of an elitist thing for the purview. For some there's always been this push, this oomph to get as many people as possible to be able to read the text, and that's a different cultural setup. But where those cultures existed and it was a purview of the elite, the invention of the printing press broke that stranglehold on sacred knowledge, holy knowledge. And then, of course, then rippled out into secular context. Once you can read the Bible, by extension, you can read a cookbook or a romance novel or a carpentry instruction book, or so you can read. Once you can read any damn thing. So it spreads out, but it starts frequently with the chief drive, the chief wish, being to read the holy text more so than to be able to read other stuff. The other stuff is a kind of a bonus afterwards. One of the knock-on consequences of this is that theology then spreads out from a highly trained elite of specialists, the bishops, the imams, the rabbis, the only people who could read it in the first place. It spreads out from them to anyone who's got the money and the education, can go into a shop, buy a copy of the text, go home, read it, and start to think for themselves, what does this mean? I know what the bishop says it means, but what do I think it means? And Eisenstein argues that this kind of turning point in history, this axis in history, is the development of independent individual thought. I'm not convinced it is. I suspect people were engaging in a lot of independent thought much earlier, but anyway. It moves from people thinking, well, the bishop says it means this, therefore I will agree, even if I don't understand a word the bishop just said. I trust the bishop, they're clever, they know what they say it means, that's what it does mean, end of. I will take the word of the clever elite. It goes from that to people who are manual workers, people who are shopkeepers, and all sorts of people at all sorts of levels of society who can now read it and think for themselves what it might mean, and this is a kind of key point for Eisenstein, start to disagree with the bishop or the cardinal or the imam or whoever it is, and start to think for themselves, well, actually, I don't think it does mean what you said it means last Sunday in the church or the synagogue or wherever it was. I think it means this. And so you get, is it independent thought or is it rebellious thought? Because in a sense, you have people challenging the authority of the religious experts. In much the same way you could argue that these days you get a lot of people challenging the authority of medical experts. You've got people who've studied donkey's years to be doctors and surgeons and all sorts of medical tasks and functions. They've gone to university, they've had years and years on the job of lived experience, but some bus driver from Hackney on Facebook thinks they know more about medicine than a doctor does. So it's that process of who feels they can challenge what has spread and spread and spread from this point of history that Eisenstein was talking about to the modern day. And not just in terms of religion, but to any subject under the sun. Or people think, well, I've read a book, or I looked at a website, or I did this, or I did that, and I have gained access to knowledge about a thing, and now I feel qualified to challenge your view, even though you've had donkey's years of study and expertise and experience and researching incredibly convoluted books about this highly involved subject. My 5 minutes on the internet is equal to your lifetime of study. Which isn't to say they're always wrong, of course, because sometimes outsiders can spot a thing that's oblivious to people who are immersed in the system. It does occasionally happen. Not very often, but it does occasionally happen. But is this, and Eisenstein is kind of arguing it is the beginning of that kind of rebellious spirit where people are not simply taking things on faith because someone with a very big hat and a very fancy robe who has spent years and years and years studying some convoluted subject tells them this is what the holy text means. They're now thinking for themselves. Doesn't mean they're thinking correctly. They may be getting completely garbled misunderstanding, but they are thinking for themselves about issues they've previously relied on experts to think about for them. And so previously they were confining their thoughts to maybe more immediate stuff, like looking after the cows or sowing wheat in the fields or whatever it was they were thinking about. And now their thoughts are turning in different directions. And of course, access to books means you can find out about things that you would never normally have found out about through day-to-day experience. So you can read about countries you've never gone to and are never likely to go to. You can read about ideas that you've never heard of 5 minutes earlier. You can read about inventions and politics and science and medicine and philosophy and any one of 100 different subjects, stuff that might never normally have played much of a role in your life. If you've got the spare cash or you're a bit light-fingered and you can nick the book when no one's looking, you can acquire information about that somebody else has written down in a book or a newspaper or a pamphlet or whatever thing it is that you've laid hands to read. So it opens up this sea of knowledge. It also starts to challenge, to change our notions of epistemology. What is a plausible source of information? So maybe 1,000 years ago somebody might have said, well, this must be true because the cardinal has said it is true. And the cardinal should know because the cardinal has been a cardinal for donkey's years and has read the Holy Scripts and has done this and has done that. They should know if this thing is true. Therefore, I don't understand it personally. It's all far too convoluted for me, but I trust the cardinal to know the truth of this thing. And then post-printing press, you've got people thinking, well, I know the cardinal says this, but I read it and I don't think it means that. Yes, I may be a baker and I've not studied theology and I've not gone to seminary and I've not worn purple robes and flounced about a church swinging a thurible, but nonetheless I think this. And so the source of epistemology, the cardinal, is no longer necessarily a source of epistemology, a source of trust in the truth of a statement, the truth of an idea, the truth of a concept. And the source of trust is perhaps coming to the individual. It's not so much, I must believe this because a very experienced person in a fancy costume has told me it's true, to I must believe this because it makes sense according to my own internal logic, my own internal experience, not only of my lived experience of day-to-day life, but other books I've read, that kind of abstract second-hand experience that comes from reading books about things you've got no immediate direct experience of. And from books, obviously, we then get into the fourth wave of culture, which is electronic culture, the internet. So even though I'm talking to you at one level, that's an oral culture, but I'm talking to you via the medium of the internet, therefore it's electronic. That opens up a whole new can of worms, and we're only just beginning to get a grip on what electronic culture does for society, both good and bad, does for individuals, both good and bad. It opens up all sorts of weird realms of possibilities, and by the time we start to get a grip on it, we'll probably be into yet another type of culture. Self-reliance, shall we say, becomes a source of epistemology, and that may be a fantastic thing. It's perhaps the birth of individual philosophy, birth of individualism, the birth of modernity, the creation of modern society, in which what I think is more important than what the bishop or the cardinal or the imam or the king or the queen or whoever tells me to think. Internal authority is more important than external authority. And so the traditional structures of society start to crumble as more and more people challenge them, fewer and fewer people rely on them. Well, rely on them, trust them. Let's put it like that. Because they want to measure things by their own internal yardstick rather than just trusting in an external yardstick to have done the measuring for them. it does free us up, but it also comes at a huge cost of isolation and loneliness and social breakdown. Maybe hopefully at some point in the future we'll achieve a balance with the pendulum will stop swinging to extremes and settle somewhere, but that may be a long time in the future, if ever. How do I know my internal yardstick is any more sensible than the external yardsticks of the bishop or the imam or the king or the queen or the president of the BMA or whoever else? I don't, obviously. And that in itself is a significant issue. And it's the sort of thing that we see flourishing now we're into electronic culture, in which you've got the sort of conspiracy theory websites and anti-vaccine, anti-this, anti-that, anti-the other, of people who don't trust the external yardsticks of traditional authority, do put a lot of trust in their own abilities, no matter how limited sometimes those abilities are. You can certainly think in terms of the Dunning-Kruger effect here, where all of us, and I include me, have a tendency to somewhat overestimate our own cleverness and think we're better at things, and in truth we actually are. And sometimes we're a lot thicker than we're willing to admit to when it comes to all sorts of things. But also we acquire other sources in which we trust. So we might not trust the man, we might not trust traditional authority, but we start trusting some fat bloke in a basement typing on his own website, and somehow think his sources of information are more valid, more reliable than the sources of information that come to us from more traditional social structures. They might be, but equally they might be incredibly wacky and dangerous and unstable. How do we evaluate these sources of information, and how does this all play into polytheism? Well, the poly element, having many gods, also I suggest many sources of truth, different forms of truth. We all do anyway, no matter what religion or lack of religion we are. We all utilise different sources of truth and validity for different notions, different claims, different ideas and experiences. But I suppose the idea within polytheism is that we're maybe a little bit more upfront about it, a little bit more open to the fact that what is true in one context we may require, or what is a standard of truth rather in one context, may not be an acceptable standard of truth in a different context, and that we need these different standards to pray at different altars, as it were, and look to different forms of truth for different claims, different notions, different concepts, and examine those sources of truth on a relatively regular basis to make sure they are still up to par. We're not trusting in some form of evidence which actually is not terribly reliable and not terribly useful. It doesn't help within postmodernism where truth goes out the window entirely, but we're sort of now into postmodernism, and it's getting ever so silly. But that's a ramble for another day. I've lost track of where I'm going. How do we understand where we are going? We're moving perhaps from not only these waves of oral culture and manuscript culture and all the rest of it, but also waves of different forms of ontology, different forms of understanding reality. We've had a period of what we might call the paradigm of faith. And that's another thing I should point out before going any further. Having said, much as we said about these waves of manuscript and oral and everything else, when you put it like that, it sounds as if you have an oral culture, then that stops, and you have a manuscript culture, and then that stops, and you have a print culture. That's not true. That's not how it works. All of these cultures coexist. It's just that at one point culture was almost entirely oral, and then other things took a dominance, but it doesn't mean the thing before it went away. So we live in an oral culture. Most of the communication we engage in with other human beings is oral. We talk to people. That's what we do. So quite a chunk of it is manuscript. Well, I say quite a chunk. Maybe that's changing actually, in fairness. But we still write letters. Maybe it's more people of a certain age group that tend to write letters, but we do. And students in class, they write their notes out. A lot of them, some of them type them up, and a lot of them write their notes out. And we might write Christmas cards and birthday cards, and so there is still the written manuscript, the handwritten culture. There is still that. We have the print culture of all the books that some of us like to read by the shed load, and we have electronic culture of pinging emails and texts and Instagram and all these god-awful things that fly back and forward, and websites and all the rest of it. So we've got all of that coexisting at the same time. So when I move on to talk about paradigms of faith and of consciousness and of language, I'm not talking about we had faith and then it's gone and it's replaced by the next thing. I'm saying that at one point in history, this one was very dominant, and then another one was added to it, and then another one was added to that. So it's not that the ones that were previous disappear into oblivion. They're still there, but they're added to. It's a bolt-on. So each of these things is a bolt-on rather than a replacement for what went earlier. So a paradigm of faith is the notion that historically, and still many parts of the world, in fact, including modern Britain, we're not just talking about further flung parts of the world, people take things on religious faith. Many people still do. That something is true because God, Allah, Buddha, Zeus, Apollo, Gaia, whoever, has told us it's true. Now, they might have told us it's true through the medium of a revealed scripture. We read the holy book, on there we see the words of the divine. That's how it works for some people. For other people, they may be meditating and they have a blinding vision, and it's a direct communication from the divine. So there's all sorts of different ways. For some people, it's more of a vague impression and a notion. But we have the sense of things revealed to us by metaphysical beings, God, deities, angels, pixies at the bottom of the garden, ancestors, totemic spirits, whatever it may be. A being has revealed a truth to us, and we trust that truth and we trust that being not to lie to us or wind us up. And I suppose also we trust ourselves not to misunderstand what's being said to us, because it's a two-way. It's one thing to have Charlton Heston talking to you from a bit of burning shrubbery. It's another thing to realise that you have correctly understood what Charlton Heston was saying to you. You've not misunderstood or misheard or whatever. So it's a kind of meeting of the divine and your own capacity to understand the divine. Meet in the middle. That still exists, but obviously at one point in history that was the dominant mode. It's no longer the dominant mode necessarily. From there we've moved into the paradigm of consciousness, certainly with the growth of psychology and the study of the mind and the capacities of the mind and the limits of the mind, and the fact that we often make mistakes, we get things wrong. And that begs awkward questions about the paradigm of faith, that we know and have known for millennia that people have hallucinations. That not everyone who hears the voice of Charlton Heston talking to them from the shrubbery is having a religious experience. Even when the paradigm of faith was the dominant one in society, we still had the idea that some people were insane and were hallucinating and imagining things. And that it wasn't real. And there is this difficulty of how you distinguish between a real spiritual experience and a hallucinated one. When is it really the voice of Charlton Heston, and when are you just imagining it? That's not a clear-cut issue. But the development of psychology as an academic area, as a medical area of what was originally in the Victorian period called alienism, and the study of the mind. As that kind of took off and flourished and became a dominant paradigm, it brought with it questions about how we, again, a question about epistemology, how do we know what we think we know? How can we trust our own mental capacities? There were parallel questions asked, not just in the age of faith and the paradigm of faith, not just in terms of saying, well, is this person mad and imagining things, but also the idea that within Christianity and Islam and so on, the idea that the devil or Iblis might deceive people, might pretend to be God, pretend to be an angel, pretend to be this, pretend to be that, and put people to a test, so that not everyone who thought they had seen an angel genuinely had. Some of them really had, but some of them might have been deceived by a demonic force that was tricking them. And how would they, as an individual and wider society, distinguish between the genuine spiritual revelation and the deceptive revelation of a demonic force? So those kinds of questions were asked even then, but they become perhaps rephrased in a slightly different way in the paradigm of consciousness, when we're starting to think about whether our own consciousness is always reliable. So Freud starts to ask questions about dreams. Are dreams just garbled nonsense, or do they mean something? Is there an unconscious mind which is conveying meaningful messages to the conscious mind, or is it all just nonsense and noise and kind of one step removed from static in the background, white noise? Not everyone obviously agreed with Freud by any stretch of the imagination, but more and more people start to say, well, actually, yes, there is an unconscious, and dreams do have a meaning, and maybe sometimes when inmates at psychiatric asylums are raving about the spiders crawling up the walls, maybe that is a metaphor and an image for something. It's not just a sort of random bit of nonsense going on in their head. Maybe it means something. Maybe it should be studied and understood. And so questions of consciousness start to come into play. And Freud and Jung and a huge number of other people start turning their attention to religious phenomena and saying, if someone hears the voice of Chartnest and booming at them, the question to be asked is not, is this the voice of God, but rather, is this the voice of their unconscious, and is it saying something meaningful to them? So don't dismiss it as irrelevant, but equally don't validate it as genuine divine manifestation. Rather see it as an internalized voice that needs to be understood as conveying some significant message from the unconscious to the conscious. And all of these different arguments start to develop, and as psychobiology gets off the ground, and the study of brain chemistry and the functioning of different regions of the brain doing different things, and studies of people who've got brain damage and how that changes their behaviour and their functioning and their personality and all sorts of other factors, the exploration of the brain as an organic system, and how different medications and drugs and alcohol and changes in diet and this and that and the other can affect how the brain functions and how our moods swing in different directions, and also a whole raft of studies of consciousness, both in the more sort of abstract sense of Freud, but also in the wet works of brain functioning come into play. And that becomes a way of understanding ourselves and asking questions about what we see and what we understand of the world. And we begin to get a grasp of things like qualia, as physics and zoology and other forms of science study the functioning of other creatures and of the universe in general. And we begin to realise there's all sorts of things in the universe we can't see, and we don't have the sense organs to register, but we can invent machines that register some of the forms of energy and things that manifest around us. So we know that there's more things out there than we are physically capable of sensing, because we just don't have the full range of sense organs to pick up on these things. We can infer the existence of radiation and all sorts of things that we cannot directly and immediately see. Or we come to realise that dogs have a wider range of hearing and a better sense of smell, and all sorts of things that can be detected by other creatures that cannot be detected by us with our sense organs, and vice versa. So the world becomes this much more complex place, which can have a kind of a spiritual, mystical angle to it, certainly, but it is usually framed in scientific terms. What we're now shifting, or already have shifted into, again, this is a sort of postmodern thing, is the paradigm of language, of dismantling language and obsessing over language and how language is used, and particularly this Marxist conflict theory notion that language is all about power and abuses of power, and kind of exertion of power by one group of people over another group of people, and rather than looking for truth and meaning and beauty and quality and the meaning of language, is rather to look at the abuses of language and the power structures within language, which I hope is a very short-lived fad, and we drop it and move on to a more productive understanding of the world, because all conflict theory seems to do is produce conflict. It's a sort of self-perpetuating mind virus in that sense. But it's a way of understanding. It doesn't, even though it has lots of negative consequences, that doesn't mean it's a completely worthless or invalid approach. Going back to what we were saying about if you were looking at a story originally recorded in ancient Greek or ancient Egyptian or whatever language, and you want to understand it now, to what extent do you need to understand the language, and is it even possible to really fully get your 21st century mind into the language of the 10th century or the 5th century BCE, or whatever period of time you're looking at? How do we quite grasp the subtleties of language, not as an argument around power games and abuses, but just understanding what is meant by words in different languages, different cultures, different periods of history? What did they actually mean when they said that? That whole kind of insight and understanding into the nature of what is said, whether you're talking about holy scriptures, whether you're talking about historical recordings, poetry, the Harvemol, the Theogony, or any other work, it's understanding the language is a challenge in and of itself, and establishing valid forms of description. I'm not sure epistemology is quite the right word to use in this context when we get onto the paradigm of language, but the way in which you describe something, or someone, or an experience, or whatever it is, can change the nature of how you understand it. And I don't just mean it in things like political correctness and sort of fattiness around words, but just the way in which a thing is described alters the nature of how we understand what it is that we are describing. And that applies as much within the religious sphere as within 100 other spheres. It opens up a lot of ideas. I'll just quickly, before I forget, the amount of time I'm waffling on for. The couple of the questions that were asked by a viewer. One was, why do modern polytheists stick to a pantheon? I suppose, in other words, is there any reason why you should only reverence Greek deities, or only reverence Japanese deities, or only reverence Inuit deities, or whatever it may be? Kind of a cultural, or sticking within a culture. Well, you don't have to, and I don't think people in the ancient world did either. There is a fair amount of evidence to suggest that where cultures rubbed up against each other through trade, through warfare, through colonization, and all of the other migration, as people had to flee areas due to famines and plagues, and they went to live somewhere else, all of that kind of mass migration and movement that took place in the ancient world meant that people who had worshipped Greek gods were bumping into people who worshipped Egyptian gods, bumping into people who worshipped Central African gods, and so on. These kind of not only meeting people, but meeting their gods as well. And that a fairly common reaction at the time was to sort of absorb, to think, oh, that's an interesting god or goddess. Oh, I quite like that statue. I'm going to buy that statue at the marketplace and put it on my altar and start. I will add your god to my gods. So we didn't. Whereas obviously we're more used to the kind of monotheism where you've got to worship this god and no other. That's a more kind of modern paradigm that we're used to in the world. The polytheist paradigm is to add as you encounter an experience. And the encountering can be at several levels. One of them is the human level. I have met someone from a different part of the world who worships different gods, and maybe I like this person, or maybe I'm just intrigued by them at any rate, and they've told me about their gods, and I'm quite interested to know more about their gods. And so even if there's not some kind of direct mystical experience of the deity, it's more the human contact, human-to-human contact, that a new deity is added. And sometimes it may be more the mystical experience that this new group of people have just immigrated to my neighbourhood. They've built themselves a temple, and one day I'll wander in and just find out what it is that they get up to. And whilst I'm in there, I have some sense of the numinous, some sense of something amazing and wonderful and magical, and now we want to add their goddess to my altar, not to ditch my own deities and replace it with a new one, but to add to it. And that's very much the kind of polytheist approach, even to the point we know that, speaking locally to this region, King Redwald, the Anglo-Saxon king, had altars to Christ and altars to Odin and Thor and his various ancient deities at the same time, and didn't see any great conflict between adding Christianity on top of his paganism. And obviously that doesn't go down well from the Christian point of view. There's meant to be one God and only one God. But from the polytheist mindset, Christ and Jehovah and anyone else you care to mention are not the only deities. They're just yet another deity in a long, long list of deities. And whether you want to add them on or not is a matter of personal choice and taste and experience, I suppose. Do you feel a calling or a yen to do so, or even, we could argue, particularly when it comes to monarchs, were altars maintained for political expediency? Not because the person praying in front of the altar had any great kind of personal conviction, or that had a metaphysical experience, a conversion experience or anything, but because it was politically expedient to do so. So that's a third approach, the human-to-human contact, the friendly kind of contact, the mystical revelation contact, and the political expediency contact, which I suppose is, let's just keep everyone happy by adding on yet another deity to the long big list of deities, and so it grows and expands. So essentially, do I think there's any issue with the need for cultural purity now? No, I don't, and I don't think there ever was. Obsessions with purity are a relatively modern thing, and I think maybe owe more to monotheism than they do to polytheism, in that you do get these kind of puritanical movements of, oh, the Christianity, the church has become corrupted, let's go back to pure Christianity as it was in the good old days. Islam has become corrupted, let's go back to pure Islam as it was in the good old days. And we don't like all this nonsense in the mosques we're hearing, let's go back to sources. There's lots of movements within the various monotheist religions, or people who want to go back to the good old days when it was pure, because they don't like what they see as the political corruption of hierarchies and ideologies and what have you. But it's contingent on this notion that there ever was the good old days when everything was pure to start with. Was there ever a period of a pure ideology? And I personally, I'm not convinced there was. Other people clearly are convinced, but I'm not. And from within a polytheist context, I think it's fairly clear that there never has been. As tribe A bumped into tribe B, tribe A acquired some gods from tribe B, and then their pantheon grew and grew and grew and grew, and it gets bigger and bigger and bigger. It's said in one of my books, gods do not have passports. They don't have concerns about border control. Deities go where deities want to go. They don't wait for us to tell them where they're allowed to go. Therefore, if someone feels drawn to a deity, I personally have no reason to see why anyone should get snotty about it. And I know it does happen. I know there are cultures in which people say, well, you are not one of us. Please go away. And that's not just, I suppose people might immediately assume I'm talking about white supremacy, which does clearly happen as a phenomenon. But it happens there are groups in Japan that object to anyone who is not Japanese worshipping in Shinto shrines. There are groups in Hawaii that object to anyone who's not a native Hawaiian worshipping Hawaiian deities, and so on around different parts of the world. So there's lots of phenomena where people from a particular ethnic group say we don't want anyone from outside our ethnic group worshipping our gods. These are our gods for our people. And that may well be a historical precedent that's been set over a long period of time, which is, people need to sort their own issues out on that one. But from my personal point of view, I see absolutely no reason. If a Chinese person wants to worship a Celtic god, or an African person wants to worship a Greek deity, why not? If that's what they are called to spiritually, why not? Who am I to start saying, you can't do that because I don't think the gods want you to worship them? Because, well, worship is a whole thing in and of itself, isn't it? But if you have contact with a deity, I see no reason why anyone else should interfere in that process, because they think you're the wrong ethnicity, or the wrong social class, or the wrong gender, or the wrong this, the wrong that, the wrong the other. It's between you and your deities. Whether you engage in collective acts of reverence and worship is an entirely different story, because obviously no one should be forced to stand next to someone they don't want to stand next to in a religious service. It's their choice who they stand next to, so sort that out for yourselves. But when it comes down to individual acts of devotion, and acts of devotion in which I would participate with some other person, I don't see why these kinds of cultural purities should be an issue. Where it becomes, I've got a fly buzzing around it, where it becomes more of a confusing one, I think, is that there are resistances. I've had these discussions quite a few times with people, or concerns, resistance is concerns, with people around the idea of, within the space of a single ritual, a gathering which meets to conduct a ceremony for some reason or another, should you have a cultural mixture of deities being turned to? So in other words, should you, in the breadth of the same religious service, be honouring Thor and Hecate and Baron Samedi, all in the space of the same ritual? I personally wouldn't, because that would just seem a bit chaotic and messy to me. But if other people want to, why not? Because, again, historically, I don't think that would have been a terrible issue. So you would have had people engaging in multiple acts of worship in their own homes, probably not in temples, because the evidence seems to suggest that temples, there was a temple to Aphrodite and a different temple to Minerva, so temples tended to be focused on a deity rather than a big mix and match of deities, except for things like the Parthenon, where you had lots of deities shared together, which is a different situation. But what you do in the privacy of your own home or garden or wherever it is that you're going to meet, I don't see that as an issue so much personally. It's not really anything to do with, or is it? I don't know. Is it anything to do with epistemology? I suppose the epistemology I'm drawing on here is historical evidence and personal experience to justify my points of view on that one. The Ryder question, there was a second question about gods and cultural purity, but I think I've kind of answered that already, in that I don't personally think the gods do care about these notions of cultural purity. That does beg some weird questions about how we as polytheists view the afterlife, or the realm beyond. I don't necessarily mean the afterlife for dead humans, but the realm beyond. Do we think there is like a Greek bit over there and a Scandinavian bit over there, and a Zimbabwean bit over there, where like little islands, gods cluster on different islands and they don't talk to each other. It's a weird idea, isn't it? I've heard lots of discussions and participated in some of them as to whether the same beings are perhaps known by different names in different parts of the world. So there may be a certain entity which is known by one name to the Greeks and a different name to the Egyptians and yet another name to the Maoris and yet another name to the Algonquins. And so actually it's the same thing, it's just known by lots of different names. And I'm more than willing to think that's a plausible idea. I don't necessarily think that you can do this kind of cardboard cutout mix and match that a lot of authors and books want to go for, where they say, oh, well, this deity is exactly the same as this, and this deity, because they've all got so-and-so thing in common. I think that's a bit like saying every single person with ginger hair is the same person. We're not, or are we? But we're not. I think that's too kind of simplistic cardboard cutout thinking. But I'm quite prepared to believe that there are at least some beings which are known globally to humanity and maybe well beyond humanity, and are known by lots and lots of different names and depicted in different images, statues, paintings, carvings, whatnot, but are actually basically the same being. I'm willing to go along with that idea. I don't know which beings, don't ask me to tell you which ones, but I'm willing to go along with that idea that happens. And that therefore in the afterlife, or the realm and beyond, you don't have islands with 20-foot walls around them that mean the Greek deities never know about or talk to the Chinese deities and they're in separate camps. I should imagine in the world beyond it's a hell of a lot more confusing and fluid than we humans think. We're used to thinking in terms of our little territories and divisions by language and by culture and by this and that and the other, and dividing things up into neat little pigeonholes, but I don't think cosmically it's anywhere near as pigeonholed as that. And I think we'll be in for a lot of surprises as and when we ever reach a state of mind where we can understand what's going on at that level. But I've talked for more than long enough on that, looking at the time slot there. So I'll leave it here for the time being. Again, if anyone's got any more questions, it'd be really nice to get some feedback and interaction. And I'll probably do a third one, because looking at my scrappy notes about things to mention, there's various things I still haven't mentioned, even after all this hours and hours of waffle. So I'll probably do a third one at some point, but if anyone's got any questions to help shape, structure that would be helpful.